Hi everyone. I'll give everyone a moment to tune in. When you come on, say hello so I can see you there. Make a comment, let me know where you're from as you're coming in. Welcome, welcome everyone. I'm just going to give people a few more minutes to come on. Feel free to say hello so I can see if I will be able to see your comments. All right, great. I see Garrick there. Hi, Garrick. All right, welcome. Well, for those of you who are tuning in or perhaps watching later, I'm David Kessler. And I'm coming to you with collaborating with Legacy.com, and I'm so thrilled that they've put this together. And we're going to be talking about the new Facebook show that just ran its course and had its season finale, which is Sorry for Your Loss. So if people are just tuning in, we'll be talking about that. I'm going to do a bit of a recap, and then we'll talk about how it ends and maybe what's next for it. So welcome. As you come on, say hello if you would, and let me know where you're from and a little bit about your world if you want. So I know it's early for many folks and it might be a work day, and this will obviously be available in the replay. So I want to talk to you about the program, the series, Sorry for Your Loss. And one of the things that Legacy asked me to do is to recap the show and talk about it not from the perspective so much about whether it was good or not, and it was good, but also about how realistic it was in grief, what rang true for people and what didn't. So I'm going to give you some of my comments as well as some other comments that I've seen from people. So first of all, in terms of TV shows and movies and series about grief, I often just applaud them when someone has done something around this subject because there's so few things that are done. And grief is so individual. It's really hard to capture experiences about something that on one hand is universal and on the other hand is very unique to each of us. So what was true and what didn't ring out as true in the series? One of the things I think that the series did was it captured moments so well. It captured milestones that happened in the series and markers that seem to ring true for so many people in grief. And when I've watched TV shows about grief, sometimes, I'm cringing because they're getting it so wrong. And sometimes we almost settle for less just because someone tackled such a challenging subject as grief. But with Sorry for Your Loss, you did not have to settle. It has lots of authentic, sharp moments that people have really identified with. It opens with a grief group that the main character Lee is attending now that her husband has been widowed. And grief groups on TV just tend to be one-dimensional or a joke, or they just make everyone seem so sappy. And here was a group where we saw lots of different people and personalities, and the characters were all their own people. The characters we get to know are her sister who's dealing with addiction, her mother who's struggling with getting back into the dating world as well as running her own business and just trying to hold this family together. And one of the things that the show does so well that I think does reflect grief is when we're on the road of life, death comes along and suddenly takes us off the road we wanted and were prepared for, and puts us on another road. And that's what this show has done so well. If you're just tuning in, by the way, I'm David Kessler here on Legacy.com. Many of you know me from grief.com. as well as the work I've done for decades in the field of grief. And I'm also here as a bereaved person myself. So I see this as a professional, but also like you, someone who's had to deal with grief. And one of the things that I loved about the show is a concept I often talk about in grief, that grief must be witnessed. We weren't meant to be islands of grief. And many times people will tell me their loved one is in grief and they want to take them to a comedy or a fun movie. And I'm like, no. You want to take people who are dealing with grief to actually something like this, a show about it, because we identify with it, we connect. We don't want to be cheered out of our grief. We want to see others experience it. So let me go through the episodes with you briefly. The first episode was called One Fun Thing, and we meet all the characters, and we start with the main character, Lee, who is in the grief group, and then the next, hi Marge and Shannon, who are joining us. The next thing we see is her mother waking Lee up, and she has this line, she says, "I don't want to be awake." And her mother just, says to her, no one wants to be awake in the morning. But the way she said it, I think, resonated with people in grief, that feeling of, I don't want to be awake in this world without my loved one the way they were, that we're waking up into a new reality. And we hear her talking about people saying to her, it's not the end of the world. But she says, but it is the end of my world as I know it. And as I mentioned in this first episode, we also meet the other characters. We meet Matt, who we see flashbacks of his life. Matt is her husband who died. And we also see the brother, Danny. And it's interesting, the idea of seeing Danny, who helps us understand what it's like for a sibling. He says in the very first episode, as a brother, people say to him, oh, your brother died. Were you close? As if they're deciding on how much sympathy they're going to give. And Lee talks about how people had like one or two conversations and then they just quit bringing up the fact that her husband died and they don't talk about it anymore. And I think people in grief understand that concept, that it just kind of got addressed and then people are moving on, and they don't understand that when you're in grief, you're not moving on quite as quick. I even remember a really wonderful woman that I know who was a friend of, her son was a friend of my son's. And I ran into her a while back and just casually ran into her, and we were talking, and she said to me, you seem sad, what's going on? And I had to say to her, well, my son died, and I think it was because, it's been over a year, surely that's not still upsetting you. And people in grief know that, yes, we're still there, we're still remembering that pain. And, the two conversations that people had with us don't kind of handle it all. The other thing that someone posted under the first episode that I thought was great, they said the show is painfully accurate, but I can't turn it off. We want to see it. Episode 2 was called Keep Toss or Give Away. And Lee had to go through her husband's belongings and her apartment. And one of the things I think the show did that I think many people in grief, and please, as I go through these episodes, if you have any thoughts you want to share about them, I would love to hear this. This can be a two-way conversation with the magic of Facebook. So feel free to comment on any of these episodes as we lead up to the finale that we just saw. And by the way, if you haven't seen these, one of the reviews I saw is this is all binge worthy. So I hope you'll go back and watch all the episodes if you haven't had a chance. So we see Lee having to deal with her husband's possessions and her possessions of their apartment that they created together. And there were so many flashbacks that I thought really helped people understand what people in grief go through, that it's not just the object, it's not just the place, but it's all the memories that we had in that place or with that object or with our loved one. And when someone dies, there's no more of them. So when we're trying to look at their phone or look at things or look at belongings, we want more about them because they've now become limited. And I think, you see her beginning to look through things, wanting to understand her husband better. I also think once again in episode 2, they showed how even the sister Jules all of a sudden saw a razor that had Matt's hair in them. And she was like, wow, this is, part of Matt who died. So we saw how it impacted the sister-in-law. And the episode begins, we see that Lee has been struggling to get into her husband's phone. She wants to understand what happened to him. Then in episode 3, I thought it was brilliantly called Jackie O and Courtney Love. And as I mentioned, so many shows we've seen sort of show the one-dimensional person in grief. And here we were able to see, in Sorry for Your Loss, many different types of people grieving. And it was how the main character, Lee, is just not a positive, peppy, trying to see the bright side part of grief. And she meets, Lee, who's just angry and upset and in pain. And she says to her in this one moment, look, we're not going to be friends. You're Jackie O and I'm Courtney Love. And it's this idea that people all grieve differently. And I think one of the messages that it gave that really struck people, and I think we all find so true, is that it's not about should you be happy, should you try to find the silver lining, should you be angry. It's about being authentically wherever you are in grief and just being true to what's coming up to you. We also saw how we idealize people after they die, and then we have to face the idea of who they might have really been and all the details about their life that come up. And then as we moved into episode 4, it was called The Visitor, because Lee finds a dog in the road and calls it the visitor. And you see her struggle, I think, as people in grief do with, my gosh, should I keep this dog? Should I begin to care for this dog? Should I love this dog? And it's basically us asking, is it safe to attach again? Can we attach again? Do we want to attach again? And the episode ends with Lee finally getting into her husband's phone. And I think so many people have found, gone through their loved one's phone, seen many things. Shannon asked, where do we find the episodes? We'll put this link in there because you're going to find them on Facebook and in a lot of places that you may stream on your TV. So we'll have someone from Legacy put up the link for you to find them because they are really worth watching. So she finally gets into her husband's phone, which leads us to episode 5, and it's called Unheard Messages. And they really poetically, tragically took us through the last days of Matt's life by listening to his phone messages. And I know people, as you watch this, have listened to your loved one's messages and looked through all the last emails and things of their life and tried to put together this piece of what it was like for them before they died. I think we all have a curiosity of what did my loved one, what was their last day like? And so we begin to see all these messages. And one of the things, sometimes they would just have a concept that they just sort of threw out there that I thought was really interesting. And the concept was about a study that's been done about what's called our happiness set point. That supposedly we have a happiness set point. And in this study, they studied people who had had horrific things happen, like they had been paralyzed, and compared them with people who had wonderful things happening, supposedly, like winning the lottery. And they found whether you had an amazing, wonderful thing happen or an amazing, horrible thing, we kind of go back to our set point. So it's an interesting concept to think about in your grief. You're never going to go back to where you were. You're never going to be the same again. But do we go back to our set point? Just a question they asked that's interesting. And then as we hear the messages, we begin to have it revealed more and more that Matt in his life struggled with depression. And we begin to see how and what his struggle was like through different flashbacks. And then when we get into episode 6, it is Lee's birthday. And she decides at the last moment, only as you can on Facebook or Instagram, she decides, or any of the other social media, to throw herself a party the day of her birthday. And she invites everyone she knows on Facebook. And what I thought was so fascinating, and of course, they're always so good about showing you many characters about what's going on for the mother at the party, and also what's going on for Lee's father, and also how the sister Jules, who's dealing with addiction, is tempted there. But Lee's character has a friend who shows up who did not attend the funeral. And she has a very interesting conversation with her friend that I think a lot of people in grief will identify with. I think for most people in grief, you have a friend, a family member who just didn't show up in your grief and around the death and maybe at the funeral the way you thought they should have. And the exchange that happens that I think is more common, I see this in my work dealing with people in grief, and I've seen this in my own life, is that someone actually said to Lee, I couldn't come to the funeral. It was just going to be too hard. And Lee says something like, it was too hard for you. It was too hard for me. And I think so many people in grief resonate with that idea that, wait a minute, you didn't come because you thought the funeral would be too sad or too hard? The funeral isn't supposed to be entertaining for people. Funerals are supposed to be sad, and they are tragic, and we do show up for each other. But how do we deal in the aftermath with those in our life that didn't show up? And I think, she just says at one point, I can't forgive you yet. And I think that's a challenge that a lot of people deal with. Episode 7 had a lot in it. It was called I Hate Chest. And at one point, Lee is crying and really having a tough time. And she's asked, all right, what kind of meltdown are you having this week? And it was that idea that just her wanting to understand and asking questions about her husband and crying was sort of deemed a meltdown, and not just her trying to put together the pieces of what happened in her life with her husband. And we also see flashbacks to an anniversary party that Matt and his family had about their father dying. So we see that their father died, and it's kind of revealed that their father dealt with depression. So we see that there's a lineage of Matt's father having depression and now him dealing with depression. And Lee decides to go visit her mother-in-law, and it's been 4 months. And Lee shows up. And I don't think we kind of got it, but once you saw it, it made sense. Her mother-in-law gets excited that maybe Lee is there because she's pregnant. And she says something like she just wanted more. And I think that's not unusual, that you want there to be more of your loved one. And that's what she was hoping for. And the other thing that came up in that episode that I think people deal with in grief is Matt, Lee's husband who died, it turns out actually called Jules, Lee's sister, before he died. And Jules is left with the questions of, why was he calling me? Was he calling me just to say hi, or he was on his way to go take a hike? Or was he maybe calling to say he was upset? And she was going through all those what ifs and if onlys that I think so many people in grief deal with afterwards. So I think that resonated and connected with a lot of people. Which brings us to episode 8, which was A Widow Walks Into Her Wedding. And in this, Jules and Lee are going to Lee's best friend's wedding. And I think the same way we see Lee dealing with that idea of, I have to get this together and show up for my friend's wedding. But she was so afraid she would burst into tears and not be able to be present. And she said, I don't want to be there crying and make it all about her. And I think we saw how when you're in grief, you're struggling to honor your own emotions and yet still show up for friends. And I don't think friends and family members realize the struggle that people go through to sort of have that balancing act. And then we saw, as Lee was dealing with so much of her own anger, there was a scene that I know so many people have commented on. And the scene was, she's doing dishes, Lee is doing dishes, and she's so angry that she breaks a dish on purpose. And as she breaks the dish, her mother happens to walk in. And you expect Lee's mother to see her breaking a dish and going, honey, you've got to be more careful, or scold her. And instead, her mother hands her another dish to break, and hands her another dish to break after that. And I saw so many people commenting like, wow, I want a mother like that, who sort of gets the anger that someone might feel in grief, and that it might be worthy of breaking dishes. And I think so many of us have felt that anger and that, fury after losing someone, and wish we had someone that didn't say, calm down, but instead gave us one more dish to break. And then in episode 9, it was called Welcome to Palm Springs, and Lee finds out that she was gifted a couple of nights, I believe, in Palm Springs. And it got a little dicey here for some people, and it was interesting. I had some conversations with some friends and people I talked to about, Lee is around 4 months into her grief, and when she's at this hotel, she does meet another man. And there was this conversation that I had with a few people about, at 4 months, if you're a widow, and I'm certainly not a widow or a widower, so I don't pretend to know the answer to this. Are you thinking about other people, or are you still fantasizing and focused on your husband or wife who died? So I think that's an interesting question if people want to comment on that for us to maybe share about as people watch this later. But in the episode, Lee meets a man at this hotel, and they end up having sex. And, was that realistic? Does that happen? I think things like that do happen in grief. It can be a way we deny the pain. It can be a way we cope with the pain. It can be a way we just try to figure things out. I mean, there's a million reasons why that happens the moment it happens for people in grief, and for everyone it's different if it was a romantic relationship. And it brings us to the season finale. And in the season finale, it's called The Penguin and the Mechanic. And we see Lee in her support group. Before the support group begins, she's talking with her friend who's in the support group, and they're talking about having sex again after your husband had died. And her friend asks her, how was the sex? And she says, it was good. But she says it in a strange way. And her friend says to her, yeah, when things are good now, there's all this other stuff that comes with it. And I thought that was such a great line, not just about sex, but about any time we're trying to begin to live again after we've had a loss. And when we are beginning to live again and we try to have anything that feels good, it's good, but we're kind of guilty that we're living again. And then another moment that I thought was so fascinating, that rang true for a lot of people I saw, is when Lee was upset that she was at the grave and she did not feel anything for the first time. And many people I've heard go, oof, there was that moment that I didn't cry for my loved one when I was supposed to. And she also has to grapple with the idea of what should she do with Matt's comic book. And they decide to consult a medium. I can tell you, for years as a grief specialist, people have said to me, should people in grief go to mediums? And I've always said, it is not my place to tell anyone what they should or shouldn't do in grief. But I can tell you, people in grief do go to mediums many times. That's not unusual. And, I just always tell people, be safe. Good mediums don't cost a fortune, and they don't want you to be dependent and keep coming back. And then as the finale's happening, we see the question coming up of, did Matt end his own life, or did he actually just fall off the cliff? And one of the things that we're seeing as we're learning more about addiction and mental illness and all these things is that Lee shares the story with Matt's brother Danny that someone in her group found a loved one who died by suicide. And that she said, either way with her loved one, they either died of a mental illness or it was an accident. But we're learning now with mental illness that they weren't running from life, they weren't doing something selfish. We're realizing death by suicide is around being mentally compromised on some level by different stressors in the world. And then we see Lee's brother-in-law say to her, it's just too hard to be around you. And I think many people in grief will identify that feeling of it's too hard. And part of the episode ends with Lee talking about, now for her, this life is just too hard. But she's so afraid if she lets go of the pain, she'll have to finally let go of her husband, Matt. And I hope what she'll realize is that what so many people in grief ultimately realize is that you can let go of the pain and just be connected in love. And I think that's one of the goals in grief work, is to remember those who have died in time, at our own pace, with more love than pain. And then there's the final scene. And I would love if in time, as you watch this and watch the episodes, I'd love for you to comment on what you think about that final scene. I think it was just so touching, poignant, important. She goes to the place where her husband died. So I think it was a beautiful series. I hope you'll watch it. I hope you'll go back. I hope this is a long discussion that we have. And one of the last moments that I think about with the show for me is there's one scene where Lee goes to her best friend, who was also her boss, and she wanted her column back that she wrote, her column that she wrote, her advice column. And he has to say to her, no, it can't happen. We had to move on and give the column to someone else. And it resonated with me, and I think with so many other people in grief. There is that moment that you say, can I have my old life back? And you just can't. And the other thing I want to mention about the whole series that I've seen people comment on is some people thought that Lee's character was a little too angry. And I'll tell you, some people in grief go to sadness. Some people in grief do go to anger. And I always say, if you've seen one person in grief, you've really only seen one person in grief, because everyone is so different. And then the question that was posed is, will there be a season 2? And I hope there is a season 2 and that we get to do this and have more discussions about this shows. And I hope this wonderful show that Facebook did will inspire other shows. And I also want to say, whether or not there is a season 2, for those of us who are in grief and have dealt with grief and loss, there is a season 2 and there is a season 3. And there's so many more days in our life. And I hope you know Legacy.com has so many groups and resources to help you through these tough days. And I saw someone posted about how hard grief is, and grief is so hard and horrible and tragic when it comes to our world. And it turns our life upside down. But you don't have to be alone. And there is help out there. So please look at Legacy's groups and their resources. Please check out grief.com. And I look forward to our conversation continuing, and hopefully a season 2. And I want to thank Facebook and Legacy for making all this happen. And it was a beautiful show to watch, and I hope you feel the same. I'm David Kessler. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I'll see you again. Thanks for doing this, Legacy.